Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum. More specifically, we're going to discuss the ETH Bitcoin valuation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, as it relates to the ETH Bitcoin valuation, I think there are a lot of effects based on monetary policy. So I also think that there are effects based on the 4-year cycle, right? The halving cycle of Bitcoin. And what I would like to do in this video is show where I think the ETH Bitcoin valuation is within the cycle and talk about what to look for if it's going to potentially deviate from that. All right. Now, remember, back in 2021, early 2022, the idea that ETH Bitcoin was going to go back down to 0.045 or wherever it went was completely absurd to a lot of people. And one of the reasons for that was because of the tokenomics, the transition from proof of work to proof of stake, right? The deflationary mechanism. These were reasons, right, that were given as to why ETH Bitcoin would only go up. And the thesis that we really put out back then was that while it's true that this deflationary mechanism is a good thing, right? And it's great that the transition from proof of work to proof of stake went smoothly. All of that is great. And the reality is that the ETH USD valuation has done remarkably well, right? So this is not about that. This is about, can it durably outperform Bitcoin, right? That is the argument. It's not, can it outperform Avalanche or Polkadot or Cardano? It's, can it outperform Bitcoin before there's a pivot in monetary policy? That is the discussion that we're trying to have. And sometimes I feel like there are a lot of sort of straw man things, and I'm not even, people are arguing against me that I'm not even arguing. I'm not arguing that it can't outperform those. What I'm saying is, have we reached a point where it can outperform Bitcoin? Have we reached that point? And I will say this. You guys know my views on ETH Bitcoin, and it's been pretty clearly mapped out. The first video on my channel is from September of 2019, and it was on the ETH Bitcoin valuation, and I said it was a sleeping giant, and we were about to go in a massive bull run for ETH Bitcoin. And then up here, I said that ETH Bitcoin was in a distribution phase, and that we were likely going to spend a few years going back down. All right? So, where are we now? Well, let's start off with a positive thing for the ETH Bitcoin valuation in terms of what my opinion is. The positive view that I would have about ETH Bitcoin is that I think in 2025 it will go up. Okay, so let's start there. So before the pitchforks come out, let's go ahead and start there. I think that in 2025, ETH will gain value against Bitcoin. That is my view. All right, so let's start there. Now, first of all, before we go further, why? Why would I say that? Why would I say that? Well, one of the reasons is, if you look at prior moves, right? You can see that 2017 and 2021 were both years where the ETH Bitcoin valuation went up a lot, right? And those were post-halving years for Bitcoin, post-halving years. So just simply looking at that alone would make me believe that there is a decent chance that ETH will gain value against Bitcoin in 2025. But what's fascinating is that I'm not even using this. Like, I'm not even using this to sort of develop this view about ETH Bitcoin. It's not just the fact that it went up in 2017 and 2021. It's not about that. Although that is nice confluence with my views. What I would say is this. I there is a chance, and I know a lot of people aren't going to want to hear it, but the people that don't want to hear it now, they didn't want to hear it back when it was a 0.08. There is a chance that's more than a non-negligible chance, right? There is a realistic scenario where ETH Bitcoin could put in one more low. Again, it doesn't have to happen, but it is possible. And I want to outline two scenarios where it could theoretically happen. I will say this as well. The spot ETH ETF is likely going to be launching relatively soon. So it doesn't mean that this process has to play out right now. In fact, if it were to play out, for those people that like following the 4-year cycle, if it were to play out like 2016, then it means final capitulation for ETH against Bitcoin won't even begin until September, if it were to play out like 2016, which is also something that we have talked about. And it's interesting, there's this pattern that has reoccurred for the ETH Bitcoin valuation, and you can see it pretty clearly. And what it is it's a high. Whoops, it's a high followed by setting a low that ends up being support for a while later, and then a lower high. And you'll see it happen time and time again. A high, you set a low that acts as support for a while, but then you set a lower high. Same thing, right? A high, go down, set the low that'll later on act as support for a while, and then set a lower high. And you can see that this pattern has played out 2 times in the past, right? Where you have a high, a lower high, and then the ETH Bitcoin valuation goes back down to the lows, and then it eventually capitulates below the lows. Pretty clear, right? Now, the question is this capitulation here sufficient to argue that this has already happened? That is the question, right? Is it sufficient? I would lean towards no, but I will say this. If ETH Bitcoin does not put in a new low by the end of the year, then it's probably not going to happen. That is what I would say. If it does not happen by December 31st of 2024, then it's probably not going to happen, or it's probably not going to go any lower this cycle. I think the main area of weakness for the ETH Bitcoin valuation will start around September. Around September is when the weakness could theoretically start. And I just want to go through where that weakness could come from. Okay? And I think there's 3 different ways to look at this where the weakness could theoretically come from. Remember, that doesn't mean ETH Bitcoin can't go back up between now and September. It's possible that it could. And in fact, if we were to follow the 2016 cycle, a lot of people like to compare this Bitcoin cycle with the 2016-2017 cycle, and I can get on board with that view. I mean, if you look at a lot of the market structure of Bitcoin, it does seem relatively similar to the 2016-2017 cycle. So if you agree with that view of Bitcoin, then perhaps take a look at what happened in Q4 of the halving year for Bitcoin. We can see that ETH Bitcoin capitulated. Okay? Now, what's fascinating is if you zoom in to 2016, you'll also notice that about halfway through the year, ETH Bitcoin swept these lows and had a fake out below the lows. After that, it basically trended up until September, the week of September 19th. Do you see that? The week of September 19th, and then following that, it rolled over and then dropped for about 3 to 4 months, about 3.5 months or so, until the end of December. And then we got into the following year, and ETH Bitcoin picked back up. Okay, it's pretty clear, right? You see that pattern. You sweep the low in the summer of the halving year. You then rally for a few months. Note that right after this capitulation, ETH Bitcoin had a move all the way back up here. Then note that after ETH Bitcoin had this move up, it came back down and slowly grinded higher until September. And then it swept the high. You see that? It swept the high, and then it capitulated into the end of the year. Now, that's pretty clear what happened in 2016. And I think it makes sense to compare to not only last cycle, but also the cycle before. And in the cycle before, we saw ETH Bitcoin begin its capitulation in September. So let's go take a look at this cycle. You can see that it also swept these lows about halfway through the halving year. It also had a really aggressive move up to around 0.057. You see that? You could argue that there's similarities here between what's going on now with ETH Bitcoin and what actually happened back in 2016. So if it were to play out like 2016, then it would involve ETH Bitcoin hanging out around these levels and potentially sweeping this prior high from May by September at the latest, if it's going to follow 2016. That's the 2016 comparison. I think it's valid. I think it makes sense to look at that. You could have a scenario where ETH Bitcoin slowly grinds up, especially after the launch of the spot ETF, and maybe it actually sells off. I mean, there's a chance where if the spot ETF for ETH follows what Bitcoin did, you might get something like this where, it rallies up and then it just sells off back near the lows in August, right? Which would only be a couple of weeks from now, which would be kind of interesting, followed by a grind back up. Now imagine that. Imagine if it does something like that, where you get this spot ETF launch, and as that happens, ETH Bitcoin goes up near the highs, not the actual highs, but just the prior local highs, and then the following week or so, it sells off into the launch of the spot ETF, and then perhaps it picks up steam, rallies, and then falls off in September, October, November. Now, in December. That would be if it follows the 2016 cycle. And you maybe argue that it already kind of went up near the high, and perhaps it's all the way back, heading back down towards the lows around the sort of, and then to head back up right after the launch of the spot ETF. That's an interesting comparison. Again, I understand that this is a contentious subject. I have tried my best to be as sensitive as possible, especially this year. In 2022 and 2023, I was pretty ruthless with my views on ETH Bitcoin. Okay. Admittedly, it's probably a fine time to hedge, right? I mean, like, I could be wrong about the grand finale, right? Maybe it's already happened. I could be wrong, but that's what happened in 2016. Okay. Now let's make the comparison to 2019. Now, unfortunately, the 2016 comparison cannot be made under monetary policy in the same way, because if you were to look at interest rates back then, they were effectively near zero, right? The Fed had barely started to increase rates, so they were effectively at zero. Where I think this becomes, there's more confluence with what I just said, is when you compare this cycle to the 2019-2020 cycle. So this should be somewhat compelling in my opinion. Last cycle, what happened? We saw ETH Bitcoin break prior support the same month that the Fed cut interest rates. That's when ETH Bitcoin broke support. The same month that the Fed cut rates, right? If we were to play out like 2019, then it would imply that ETH Bitcoin finds a new low in September, not sort of topping out in September. In fact, it would imply ETH Bitcoin topping out either July, August, or it could already happened, right? But then it just slowly trends back down. That would be if it were to follow the monetary policy view from 2019. Now, what's interesting here is that you can see that ETH Bitcoin broke the low right when the Fed cut rates. Now, there was a puzzling thing going on at the beginning of this year. Does anyone remember what it is? What was the puzzling thing for the Cryptoverse? Because as I've said, while I give Ethereum a hard time based on its Bitcoin valuation, and everyone's singing that it's holding up well for the last 4 years, while it's, or last 3 years, while it's dropped 40% against Bitcoin, it should hold up better than the collective altcoin market. Now, where was there some concern with that? Because to me, Ethereum, in terms of risk reward, comes after Bitcoin, but it's before all the, the altcoin market. I consider Ethereum to be kind of somewhere in between an alt and what Bitcoin is. I think Bitcoin is in a league of its own, right? I do. I'm not going to apologize, okay? It just is. The way you do well in the Cryptoverse is by preserving the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio. That is the way. You can get on board with that now, or, you can learn it the hard way, as many people have. But that is the way to preserve your valuation in the Cryptoverse over a long haul, is to value your portfolio in terms of its Satoshi valuation. If we follow 2019, it means that ETH Bitcoin could drop when the Fed cuts rates. Now, when is the Fed going to cut rates? Well, the real answer is nobody knows, right? Nobody knows. I've heard people say they're going to cut in July. There's a chance they cut in July. If something big were to happen between now and a week and a half from now, they might cut in July. It's not the most likely scenario, right? But with investing, you should always consider all scenarios, not just the one that you want to look at, right? To me, it makes the most sense that they cut in September at this point. Now, at the beginning of this year, I did not think they would make it until September, but given that the FOMC is only about a week and a half away, and given the fact that that Powell has not really opened the door for a rate cut as early as July, I do think it makes sense to assume that September is the most likely outcome. Even though a month ago I would have been more on board with the July outcome. I still think the July rate cut is possible, but I would put it at a fairly low probability at this point in time. Now, if something catastrophic were to happen between now and the next FOMC, or something that really affected the markets, then I'd be willing to flip my view on that and say, all right, well, all systems go for July in terms of rate cut. But if the Fed cuts rates in September, and if ETH Bitcoin follows what happened last cycle, then that would imply ETH Bitcoin falls below support in September, which is basically 1 month after it fell below support in 2016. Now, what's really interesting about 2016 is when you look at this, it swept this low in June, whereas this cycle, it swept that low in May, about 1 month earlier. So perhaps it's possible, maybe, just maybe, ETH Bitcoin does this sweep of the high in August, 1 month before it did it in 2016. And then by the time the Fed cuts rates in September, ETH Bitcoin is already at the lows. And then it drops, September below the lows, and then October, November, and then we get the final drop sort of the very end of the year. I could see that happening. Right? So you have two different scenarios, whether you want to compare it to 2016 or if you want to compare it to last cycle, the 2019 cycle. 2019, 2020. You can see that there was some vulnerability for Ethereum at the end of the year. Now, listen, I know whenever I put these videos out, it's marked with a lot of criticism, a lot of sort of cherry picking my views and whatnot. But listen, guys, I hope that we're at the point where everyone can just look past that and recognize that I'm just trying to give my own opinion, and I can easily and happily raise my hand and say I'm wrong if I'm wrong. Happily do that, right? So that's just what I look at, right? I look at what happened last cycle. I look at, and by the way, guys, I would love nothing more than to think that ETH is going to gain value against Bitcoin. Right? It's fun. It's fun riding the Ethereum tsunami. Like I did it last cycle. It's fun doing that. It's just that it seems like you still need things to align, and we did not see the ETH Bitcoin lows in 2016 until Q4, right? I mean, other than what happened in the very beginning of the year, until Q4, and in the 2019 period, where if you favor more comparison towards monetary policy as opposed to the 4-year cycle, then it still dropped below the lows the month that the Fed cut rates. Now, I said something earlier, and then I lost my train of thought, but I said there was something that was sort of wrong earlier this year, right? Something was off with the Cryptoverse, and now that's been fixed. What was that? It was the fact that ETH Bitcoin was below its lows, while alt Bitcoin pairs were not. That was the issue that was going on back then. So let's take a look at specifically what I'm talking about. If you were to look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, you can see that back when ETH Bitcoin was below its lows in May, if you go look at alt Bitcoin pairs in May, they were actually not below their lows, right? If the low was sort of taken as 0.4 in May, all Bitcoin pairs were all the way up here at 0.43. So that was strange, right? It was strange because normally, in the same way that Ethereum is the last thing to run at the end of a QE bull market, it's also the last thing to fall as quantitative tightening is finalized before the pivot to QE. ETH is the last thing to fall against Bitcoin. The expectation is that all other alt Bitcoin pairs would drop and already have begun their capitulation process for the most part before Ethereum begins its own. But in May, when ETH Bitcoin was down here, alt Bitcoin pairs were still way up here. And I said it back then that this is weird, like that's confusing. And that it makes sense to hedge and not just go into this assuming that the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation has to immediately capitulate. There was always a chance that it was going to do what it did in 2016 and rally back up and then potentially fall off later on in the year. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Because remember how I said that in the last business cycle, ETH Bitcoin broke support when the Fed cut rates. But alt Bitcoin pairs broke support 1 month before the Fed cut rates. Alt Bitcoin pairs broke support last cycle in June of 2019, not July when the Fed actually cut rates. They broke support in June. Now, what's fascinating about this, is that when they broke support, it was right after the Fed came out at FOMC and said they're not going to cut rates until next year, until 2020. The market threw in the towel. Okay. What's interesting is that the next FOMC is the last day of July. What happens if they come out and they're hawkish? They're more hawkish, right? What if they don't open the door for a September rate cut? I personally think that we're going to get a September rate cut no matter what they say in July. That's kind of my opinion right now. That's subject to change, right? It's possible they delay rate cuts even further. It depends on, I mean, honestly, it depends on how sticky inflation continues to be. But imagine if they come out in July and they talk a big talk and they say, you know what, we're not sure if we're going to cut in September. That could be the reason why alt Bitcoin pairs finally drop. What's interesting is if you look at alt Bitcoin pairs, it's kind of this like weird mental game that seems to be ongoing where like it seems like the correct view has been to fade alt Bitcoin pairs and to assume that Bitcoin dominance is going higher, right? That's been the correct view, whether you want to admit it or not. I mean, alt Bitcoin pairs have gone lower this year. In fact, they just put in a new low just a month ago. right? Just a month ago, alt Bitcoin pairs put in a new low. So, any view that was different than alt Bitcoin pairs going lower up until last month were wrong, right? I mean, the assumption was correct that alt Bitcoin pairs would go lower. But if you look at this, look at the low to the high, right? February to March, April to May, June to July, meaning the implication for this would be that the next low would be in August. Right? You go February, April, June. You skip a month, right? February top in March, April next lower high in May, June next lower high in July, then the next lower low would theoretically be in August, right? And what's fascinating about August is that if the Fed cuts rates in September, then August would be the month, if it follows the last cycle, where alt Bitcoin pairs would capitulate. Remember, last cycle, alt Bitcoin pairs capitulated 1 month before the first rate cut in June. So then it's like the Cryptoverse makes sense again, because earlier this year when ETH Bitcoin was below the lows and alt Bitcoin pairs were not, it kind of didn't make sense. But now it's starting to make sense, because now you have alt Bitcoin pairs that are at 0.4. Remember, it was only a few months ago where 0.4 was sort of the FUD valuation that people said wouldn't happen, right? When we were back up here in March, when we were back at like 0.49, 0.5 or so. Now we're just hanging around 0.4, and alt Bitcoin pairs are struggling to durably get above 0.4. Now, you have seen them go up to 0.41. They could even go all the way back up to 0.43 and still be at or below their bull market support band. The 20-week SMA of alt Bitcoin pairs is 0.43. The 21-week EMA is 0.42. So that's why I'm saying here, it's possible that alt Bitcoin pairs roll over starting in July. And it still could be a couple weeks away, right? I don't know when it's exactly going to occur, but I think that there's a good chance they're going to roll over. And in August, potentially 1 month before the first rate cut, then they capitulate finally below these lows. Because as I've said before, I know you guys like your alts, and I know you want alt season, but alt Bitcoin pairs, in my opinion, are oscillators at best. And when they're at 0.4, I still think they need to go to 0.25. Now, the critics, and again, I don't say that in a sort of a negative way all the time. Sometimes, like, it's good for me to have these critics that I pay attention to, because I actually do get a lot of things wrong. So it's worthwhile for me to see other opinions. The critics will say that this has not been playing out, right? That altcoins are not dropping against Bitcoin. But again, my counterpoint is, if they just put in a new low last month, how is my view wrong? Their counterpoint is that it's taking a lot longer than I thought. And both views are valid. They're right. I didn't think it was going to take this long. I really didn't. The alt Bitcoin market has held up far longer than I ever thought it was going to. I think one of the things, because it's like every couple of months, alt Bitcoin pairs test these lows, and then they're like, oh, Fed's not cutting, time to go back up, right? But maybe by August, it'll be obvious the Fed's cutting in September, and then altcoins are free to drop against Bitcoin down to the range lows. I think something like that could happen. So now it makes sense, though, right? Now it makes sense, because now you could have a scenario where alt Bitcoin pairs finally drop below the range low in August, right? In August. And then ETH Bitcoin does so 1 month later in September. Now listen, if this does not play out by the end of the year, then I think it's probably not going to, okay? It's possible if the Fed still has not cut rates, then I might change my mind on that. But I have a strong feeling they're likely going to cut at least a little bit this year. It's probably not going to be what you want, right? It's probably not going to be like 300 basis points or something. But they're probably going to give the market a couple of 25 basis point rate cuts, is my guess, at some point this year. Maybe 2 to 3. In 2019, they gave us 3. So when you look at this, I wonder if it's going to play out the same way. And again, if you don't buy the monetary policy side of it, that's fine. But if you don't buy it, well, look at 2016, when monetary policy, like, if you want to ignore it, just delete it. ETH Bitcoin still broke down in Q4. Now, the other thing as it pertains to monetary policy is that if you look at the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, look at the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. Last cycle, ETH Bitcoin did not bottom until QE started. QE has not yet started. Now, one interesting thing about this, and the Fed talked about it, Powell talked about this, is that they've reduced the pace of the balance sheet runoff, right? It used to be higher. They dropped it by like 25 billion. Okay. So because of that, right, because of that shift that occurred in June, it's almost like it's allowing things to take longer than they perhaps would have if they just kept the balance sheet runoff the same. Because last cycle, we know ETH Bitcoin did not bottom until the Fed started to expand their balance sheet. Right? Pretty clear. Over here, it's not really a fair comparison because the Fed wasn't really doing anything with their balance sheet, right? It was just going sideways. But when the balance sheet was going down, ETH Bitcoin was going down. And when the balance sheet was going up, ETH Bitcoin was going up, right? But the balance sheet is still going down. And while the pace has slowed, it is still going down. It gives them longer to allow things for inflation to come back down. So, my view on ETH Bitcoin is as follows. I think there is a decent probability that it could drop again into the fourth quarter of this year. If it doesn't happen by the end of the year, then it's probably not going to. And this is likely your low. If it does drop to a new low, I think the bottom will be between 0.03 to 0.04. That's what I would think. So those are my views on ETH Bitcoin. Now, there's one more thing I think might play a role in all this. It might be the narrative that people pay attention to. They're going to be looking over here potentially, but they really should be looking over there in monetary policy. Now, what is that narrative that might start to grab some headlines? Do you guys remember back in 2022 when everyone was like super bullish on ETH Bitcoin at like 0.085 and they said there's no way it's going to drop because of the deflationary mechanism? We remember that, right? Everyone's talking about the deflationary tokenomics, right? There's no way it can drop, and here we are. What's interesting about that is if you look at what's going on, if you look at this website here is ultrasound.money, a really interesting website. I think you should take a look at it. What's interesting is if you look at the daily, the supply of ETH is going up by about 1,600 ETH a day. So right now, it's not even experiencing that deflationary aspect, right? If you look at it over 7 days, it's up by about 12 to 13,000 ETH in 1 week. So in 30 days, it's gone up by about 58,000 ETH. Let's round it to 60K ETH, okay? Now, here's the interesting thing. If nothing changes, if the pace of this continues, meaning that there's not as much activity and there's just not as much ETH getting burned, whatever, and the supply keeps going up by about 60,000 ETH a month, how long would it take for it to grab some headlines? Well, let's take a look. Ever since the merge, the supply change of ETH to today is negative 300,000. But at the low here, when back in April, when everyone was super, bullish, right, going into the Bitcoin halving, we were at negative 456,000 ETH or so. So since April, just 3 months, the supply has changed by adding 150,000 ETH. We went from negative 450 to negative 300 in 3 months. So at a 60K ETH addition per month, how long would it take for the supply change to reach 0 from the merge? Meaning everyone that was talking about this deflationary aspect what are they talking about then, right? It'd be the perfect narrative for ETH Bitcoin to go through that final capitulation, and it'd be the perfect narrative for people to freak out, and then that's when it turns around, right? How long would it take? Well, at 60K ETH a month, and you got to go 300, that's 5 months. Let's just assume we're already through July. Let's just forget about July. July just gives you some wiggle room. And maybe with the launch of the spot ETF for ETH, perhaps it'll actually gain some activity and maybe level off a little bit. But let's just assume July's already over. You have August, September, October, November, December. That's 5 months. So at this pace of ETH supply change, it will reach the supply at the merge by the end of the year. Which for me, if you want to line it up with this stuff we've been talking about, would be the perfect narrative to cause the final true capitulation, which has occurred every single cycle. That doesn't mean that Bitcoin has to go down. It could. In 2019, when ETH Bitcoin broke down, Bitcoin went down. In 2016, when ETH Bitcoin went down, Bitcoin went up, right? So I'm just saying, look, not only can you relate it to monetary policy, not only can you relate it to the 2016 halving year for Bitcoin, you could also find a fairly compelling narrative just by looking at what people were telling me 2 years ago. Why I was wrong was because of the deflationary aspect. Well, despite the fact that ETH was deflationary, it still didn't stop it from dropping against Bitcoin, right? Maybe it slowed the rate at which it dropped, but what happens if it goes inflationary? So that I think that's like a really important part of all of this, is that ETH Bitcoin could still go below those lows, but it might not occur until, a month or two from now. Maybe not even until October. Okay. Now, one interesting thing about this whole cycle is that if you were to look at something like Bitcoin dominance, excluding stablecoins, normally in halving years, dominance goes down, right? Dominance goes down. And that's why going into this year, a lot of people were talking about how dominance would go down in the halving year, because it normally does. And alt season was about to start. But look, what does this show you, right? Dominance has been going up. Look at 2020 and 2016. These are halving years. Notice how this year, dominance excluding stables has been putting in higher lows all year. But in 2020 and 2016, it basically dropped in this part, the early part of the year, came back up, and then dropped again in Q3, and then came back up again. Here, there has been a little weakness around this period where ETH Bitcoin, or where dominance was dropping, but it didn't actually cause it to put in lower lows. It just wasn't moving up as explosively. So you could argue that there's still a period of weakness for dominance that it's got to get through. That's basic, because we're currently on day 201, and you can see that there was a low found by dominance on day 215 in 2016. And then last cycle, it was found on day 246. So you could still have a situation where Bitcoin dominance doesn't get this massive breakout, at least for a few more weeks, right? Remember last cycle, all Bitcoin pairs didn't even capitulate until right before the Fed cut. I said a month, but it really was like 2 weeks before the Fed cut, right? So it could still be a little while, for all we know. It could still be a little while. But look what happened in Q4 in both halving years. Bitcoin dominance went up. So if Bitcoin dominance can just get through the rest of July and August without absolutely capitulating, then I would argue by the time you get to September, it's likely, and late August, it's likely just going up. The other thing that's interesting with all this is to look at the ETH Bitcoin valuation, year-to-date ROI. And why I find this interesting is because a lot of people like to compare 2024 to halving years, right? So here's 2020. But you can see that it hasn't really followed 2020. You can also see that it really never followed 2016 either, right? Has it followed 2019? Sort of. It was, but then now there's been a deviation. But I was looking at this, I'm like, well, if you have half the cryptoverse believing this is based on monetary policy, like 2019, and you have half the cryptoverse believing it's just based on the 4-year cycle, like 2016 or 2020, what happens if you just average out ETH Bitcoin in 2019 and 2020? You get this. This is 2024 compared to the average of 2019 and 2020. So if it were to follow this, then you could still see some move up by ETH Bitcoin, over the next couple of months, right? It's possible, right? And even if you were to follow, what happened by ETH Bitcoin back over here, if you were to follow ETH Bitcoin back in sort of right here, you can see there was a high, a lower high, and then ultimately we came back up above that high and sort of came back near the prior high. So you could argue that we could still see something like that, right? Where we eventually come back up near this prior local top there, and then it sells off. That could play out. That's a good chance that could play out, especially, with all this spot ETF discussion for ETH. That could play out. So I think that, it could still play out, as we've talked about. But notice that even in the average of these 2 years, this has mostly been a muted version of that. And if you just simply look at the average of 2019 and 2020, the low for ETH Bitcoin was put in on day 361 of the average of those 2 years, right? So that means that for 2024, if we go below this low, then that means the low's not in, right? If we take out this May low by the end of the year, that doesn't mean that you can't have sort of a sort of a temporary bounce into August or something. Again, if you follow this chart, it would almost make you think that that's probably what will happen. If you look at like that 2016 cycle, it could follow something like this, where you have that rally up, but then it sells off just after the launch of the spot ETF. And this sell-off right here occurred August 1st, the week of August 1st, right? Which is like 2 weeks from now. So, what happens if that's what we see, right? We see this spike up followed by a spike back down, followed by it just going sideways in August, maybe while altcoins capitulate against Bitcoin, and then it finally drops after the Fed cuts rates. It's all possible, right? It's all possible that this could happen. I don't really anticipate myself doing that many more videos talking about this stuff, because you guys know my views at this point. It's been a few weeks since I provided, any thoughts about ETH Bitcoin, but I think you guys know my views. If by the end of the year, right, let's just come up with a time frame. If by the end of the year, ETH Bitcoin is still not even near the lows or taking those out, then I'm willing to pivot my view. I've learned, and I said even over here, I did a video on it. I put out a tweet on it that it's okay to hedge. Hell, it's okay to hedge here at 0.052, right? You're still, in the grand scheme of things, if you disagree with me, but you follow these views, ETH Bitcoin from the merge is still down almost 40%, right? If you traded your ETH for Bitcoin at the merge, congratulations. You preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio. You could always get some of your ETH back in case this final move doesn't actually happen, right? If the final move doesn't happen, you could always hedge. I'm not saying you shouldn't hedge. I think you probably should. I also want to be able to put my opinion out about the market without people, relying on that and that alone. Again, this is just my opinion, and you should know I frequently get things wrong, right? If it plays out like I think, then it means ETH Bitcoin doesn't capitulate until September, right? A lot can happen between now and then. That's a month and a half I mean, really, what's interesting, look at this. Look at this confluence here. You see where ETH Bitcoin topped out in 2016, the week of September 19th? Would you care to guess when the next FOMC is after July? It's September 18th. You know, what happens if ETH Bitcoin just capitulates after the meeting where the Fed cuts rates? Seems like it could happen, right? It seems like it could happen. But those are my views. I think that I think one of the interesting things about this whole dilemma, and I sort of am more so just saying this for myself and for you guys, but I think the whole thing is kind of interesting because I've had these views for so long, and every time there's been a rally, so many people come out and tell me I was wrong. And then what's really hard about being bearish on something like an alt Bitcoin pair is that it actually spends more time going up than it does going down, right? That's what's really hard about that type of a market, right? You spend so much of your time watching it trend up, right? And that's why everyone is so, I feel like so many people are so emotional about it. It's because they just see it going up all the time. They're like, how could it possibly go down? But then when it does go down, it just does it in like 1 or 2 weeks or a few weeks, and then it's done for a while. And then you just spend the next several months going back up. So, it's gone through this roller coaster for a while, right? Of, oh, Ben was right. Oh, no, spend the next 3 months saying he was wrong, right? And then again. In fact, ETH Bitcoin is one of the fewer things I've even been mostly right about, because like I wasn't even right about Bitcoin USD last year. I thought last year Bitcoin was gonna go up for half the year and down for half the year like it normally does in pre-halving years, but I was wrong, right? And again, I have no problem admitting when I'm wrong. So yeah, I mean, if you think I'm wrong about ETH Bitcoin going into the end of the year, I'd be happy to hear your reason why, rather than just say I'm wrong because you don't like me. I'd be happy to hear sort of counter views. I'd be willing to change my view if something presented itself to make me consider that, like, oh, my view is wrong. But I think if all you're going to say is that the spot ETF is going to change things, ask yourself this. Did you tell me that the transition from proof of work to proof of stake was going to change things? Did you tell me that deflationary tokenomics was going to change things? Right? Because neither of those actually changed anything. I'm not saying that the spot ETF can't be good for ETH USD. This argument is not about ETH USD. It's about, can ETH outperform Bitcoin? That's the argument. So let's be clear about what the argument is can it outperform Bitcoin, not can it go up on its USD pair? Because my argument is that if it goes up on its USD pair, it's only because Bitcoin went up on its USD pair. That's the only reason. And the reason we know that has been true is because during this entire saga that ETH Bitcoin has gone down, ETH USD has gone up for all of it, in fact. But it was only because Bitcoin was going up. Because if ETH USD was going up on its own accord, then why did it spend the last several years bleeding against the king, against Bitcoin? So I think base case for me right now is one final low for ETH Bitcoin later on this year. If it doesn't happen by the end of this year, it's probably not going to, and then that's your low in May of 2024. You could always get a scenario where it does something like this, where it comes back down and gets close to it and then doesn't actually take it out, right? But I think base case is that it will take it out. But we will see. I also think the other thing to look at is, last cycle when the ETH Bitcoin bear market was finally over, it was once we got above the 20-month SMA. Okay, so the 20-month and durably got above it, right? The 20-month SMA is at around 0.059. It's basically at 0.06, right? So once we get above that, you could argue that the ETH Bitcoin bear market might be over, because you can see last cycle when it got above it, that was when it was finally over. But it took a while, right? It took a while for it to actually get there. You could also see that in the last 2 cycles, when ETH Bitcoin's drop was finally over, it happened on 3 red candles in a row, right? And then the 4th candle was green, and that was the bottom, right? 3 reds in a row, and then the 4th was green. 3 reds in a row, and then the fourth was green. And that was where you basically formed your bottom. We haven't seen that yet, right? We've gotten, like we had a couple right here, and I was willing if we had gotten one more. I was like, all right, well that might be it, but then we got this green candle back up. I wonder if this green candle right here is kind of similar to like this one, where you get this green candle back up, and then you get two reds that kind of go back down slightly. You see that? You see that right there? And then the next one in August could be one of these, like where you get a big move up to the upside and then also to the downside. Perhaps it's the just after the spot ETF, right, that you get a big wick down and then you get a big wick back up and then you sort of level off. And then if it plays out like that, if July is that candle right there, then that means the next candle would look like this. This would be August, September, October, November, December, where the actual low either comes in November or December. Same thing right here. Right? Same thing. 1, 2, 3. So it just depends on when it starts. So if next month is green for ETH Bitcoin, then perhaps you get 3 after that. But those are my views on the ETH Bitcoin valuation. It's a bit nuanced, right? It's not just, it has to go down right now. It could, but it's more so, look, guys, we know last cycle it didn't drop below the lows until the Fed cut rates, and we're likely not looking at, we're likely looking at September at the earliest, right? Which is still a couple months away. So those are my views. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. Check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.